Good evening and welcome to tonight's program, New South for the New Southerner, Swann Case Legacy. My name is Chris Barbie and I serve as Director of Development at Levine Museum of the New South. We greatly appreciate you joining us this evening. Before we start our program this evening, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our sponsor, the Infusion Fund, a partnership between the City of Charlotte, Foundation for the Carolinas, and generous donors who support the arts and culture section. Also, a special thank you to Mertz Heart and Soul for always supporting our New South for the New Southerner series. If you wish to support the museum in its effort to offer engaging programming, content, and experiences, please follow the link in the comments section to make a donation. Likewise, we would like to have your feedback about tonight's program, including your suggestions for future topics. Feedback helps us make our programs better. You'll see the survey link in the comments section for a very short survey at any point during the program. And now for a little bit about our program this evening. 2021 marks the 50th anniversary of the Supreme Court's landmark decision, Swann versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. This ruling made Charlotte a segregated southern city, the nation's test case for court-ordered busing, and eventually created one of the country's most integrated school districts. Earlier this year, on April 20th, the actual anniversary of this landmark case, we had an insightful discussion and presentation that helped us understand the historical significance of this case. And now, with the challenges of a new school year ahead of us, Pamela Grundy and Arthur Griffin return for a second discussion on present-day challenges and opportunities, and also to reflect on the Swann case legacy. This time around, they'll be joined by James E. Ford. Well, let's introduce our panel for this evening. Our moderator this evening is Pamela Grundy, who has served as a community historian and education activist in the city for several decades. She recently produced a groundbreaking work entitled Color and Character, West Charlotte High and the American Struggle for Education Equality. Arthur Griffin is a Charlotte native that attended segregated schools and became one of the city's most vocal equal education advocates, but more importantly, served on the school board and led it through a period when busing was court mandated. And James E. Ford is the executive director of CREED, the Center for Racial Equity in Education. He represents the Southwest Education Region on the North Carolina State Board of Education. Ford is pursuing his PhD in urban education at UNC Charlotte. He previously taught world history and sociology at Garinger High School in Charlotte, and in 2014-15, he was the Burroughs Wellcome Fund North Carolina Teacher of the Year. Well, thank you to the three of you for taking your time and providing your insight on this topic this evening. We look forward to the discussion. And Pamela, I'm going to turn it over to you now to begin the conversation.
Okay, yes, thanks so much, Chris. I appreciate this and appreciate being back. We had a great time back in May discussing the Swann case, and I'm really looking forward to bringing this up to the present with just two remarkable men who have played such important roles in past and are both playing important roles in the present day education. And so I think we're going to have a great conversation. Like so many other historical events, Swann unspools forward in time. It provides along the way multiple insights into our community and into the changing times. And so Arthur, of course, you've seen the whole story from beginning to end here in Charlotte. During nearly 3 decades of in Charlotte, I've seen a good bit of it as well. Some of the revelations are encouraging, some less so, but they're all instructive. So looking forward to drawing from that tonight. I am going to start by just to catch everybody up on exactly what did happen with Swann and how quickly we got to this point. And I'm going to do that sharing my screen. Okay. And there's all sorts of, there we go. Okay, allow. And then if I do, this is new, sorry about this. Here we are. So this is screen, everybody see that all right? Swann B board? Yes?
Looks like just a black screen to me.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry. We should have practiced this. It worked great last time. Aish. Out in the show, and I will try again. Oh, this is what happens when you don't practice. We didn't practice. I'm gonna do this again. I'm gonna hit share screen. It says select window entire screen. All right, there we go. All right, allow. And then I'll go to all right, now we got it. Swann v. Board. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, just checking. I can't tell. I just see the screen. So again, the starting point, I say Swann v. Board here, but it's really not Swann, it's Brown, that outlaws school segregation, that kept Black and white students separate and deliberately made it not separate and equal, but rather separate and unequal, which was specifically designed to mark Black students as less than white students. That was a deliberate decision. Obviously, Brown made that illegal, but that was not particularly popular across the South or in Charlotte. The reaction of white Charlotteans was typical. They opposed it. You see here Dorothy Counts at Harding High School. Crowds demonstrated in public against the first students who sought to enter historically white schools, and leaders worked in private behind the scenes, devising ways to keep Black and white students separated. Thus, the need for another lawsuit, the Swann lawsuit, to force districts to actually make change. You see here on the left, Julius Chambers, the lawyer in Charlotte who filed the Swann case, and you see on the right, Judge James McMillan. Julius Chambers, quite remarkably, convinced Judge McMillan that he should order every single school in the system be desegregated, with the idea that the resources that had been so unequally distributed during segregation would only be spread evenly if students were spread evenly across the school system. This was the most sweeping order in the country. Nobody had ever done anything like that, and it was not especially popular, again, particularly with white families who opposed integrating and who opposed busing, who opposed having their students sent across town because of segregation in housing. There was no way to fully integrate the system without a massive use of busing. It also became something of a concern for African Americans because at the beginning, the white-dominated school board essentially put the burden of desegregation on African Americans, on Black children, and on Black communities. They closed many beloved Black schools. But eventually, the Supreme Court, again, 50 years ago, 71, said that Judge McMillan had the right to do it. And Charlotteans realized that this continuing conflict was not good for anyone. And they essentially reached the compromise, which everyone began to participate in desegregation. Schools were fully desegregated. Students were bused across the city. And you started to see, after a period of settling down, some really remarkable things. I like to show this picture of Sam Haywood, a young white principal sent over to West Charlotte High School, Murdy Rice, a great long-term teacher, one of the many fabulous Black teachers at West Charlotte High School, and they learned from each other, particularly Sam Haywood learned from Murdy Rice. And across the city, people learned from each other, teachers, administrators, students, and really created a different kind of school system that people became extremely proud of. The quality of education improved for everyone, and African Americans began to gain new opportunities across the city, not just in school, but in other areas as well. And this is a slide of Harvey Gantt, who became mayor of Charlotte in the early 1980s. Sort of a point of enormous pride to have an African American mayor of a predominantly white city. Now, I don't want to make this sound like it was completely perfect. It's important to understand that everything wasn't completely integrated. Scholars like to talk about the differences between desegregation and integration. Desegregation is putting students together in the same classroom or in the same school. Integration is where everyone really begins to work together and it becomes a school for everyone. Some across Charlotte, some schools, some classes just desegregated. Others moved closer to integration into a shared sense of schools and education. And then over time, however, support for busing waned for a variety of reasons. And we ended up with another lawsuit in 1997 in which a Judge Robert Potter, ruled that busing had to end. It was no longer required and therefore no longer legal to send children across the city to desegregate schools based on race. And what happened, and I was here when that happened, I remember that very well, schools resegregated very quickly, shockingly quickly, in fact, for a variety of reasons, but one particular reason had to do with housing and jobs. While schools had desegregated, neighborhoods had not, and particularly based on income. If you look on the right slide with the gray at the top, that is 1970 in Charlotte. That's housing in 1970. Darker aspects or darker parts are places where there's a higher percentage of African Americans. If you look then to the right, you see 1990, after 20 years of desegregation. And in fact, the city is more segregated by race than it had been in 1970. A large part of the reason being that there's a huge influx of people based on the boom that Charlotte has. And many white families settle in the suburban areas around the center city. Many African-American families remain lower income. Jobs don't transform the way that schools do. They didn't suddenly spread jobs around. And so these center city, historically Black neighborhoods with older, less expensive housing tends to be where African-Americans settle. In fact, continues to be that way to this day. So once busing ends, schools resegregate very, very quickly. And you see here, this is from 2016-17, and this is by poverty, but race tracks poverty quite carefully. So you have a group of schools that are mixed, but you have a group of schools that are very low poverty, predominantly white. You have a group of schools that are very high poverty, predominantly Black and brown. And you also start to see new disparities, particularly in how students are doing. You see here with EOG rating rates, you can see that the proficiency levels drop significantly from the low poverty schools to the high poverty schools. So that was quick. If I'll unshare me now. And so that was just a quick overview of what happened very quickly. Segregation, resegregation, segregation, desegregation, resegregation. So now I just want to go a little more into that, to understand a little bit more about those phases and how they relate to today. And so for this, we're going to turn to Arthur, who experienced as a student segregation and then as a parent and activist desegregation. So do you want to just start, Arthur, by talking a little bit about what you saw as a student in segregated schools?
Sure. Thank you, Pam. And certainly want to thank Levine for presenting this program. As I get older, I appreciate history a lot more than I did many years ago. Let me try to unpack that experience a couple of ways. I started public schools here in Charlotte in 1954 at Alexander Street Elementary School. Let's first talk a little bit about human resources, then we'll talk about physical resources. The teachers that I had at Alexander Street were par none. They were excellent. They were content experts. They knew their craft. They understood pedagogy. And without skipping a beat, those ladies and gents really performed miracles with us in a segregated setting down at Alexander Street. The affective part of education was just as important as the effective parts of education, meaning they really had high expectations for all of their students, that they could relate. They had feelings and empathy. They would chastise you, so to speak, using the slang in terms of how you would dress, how you would speak, how you would interact. They were just enormous. Many of them had advanced degrees that they had to leave the South to go up north to get advanced degrees. They were well prepared. And at that particular time, before they had a uniform pay schedule, African-American teachers were paid in many occasions less than white teachers because they did not have a uniform system at that time. And so these ladies and gents would work, of course, for differential pay, different than white teachers. But all of these things I didn't know, Pam. I was in the first grade. So just sort of unpacking it sort of in a different mode. But when I was a first grader, this was like heaven. We really had some of the best teachers, and even the custodians were wonderful down at Alexander Street. The physical resources at Alexander Street were different. I didn't really place a significant value at the time in 1954, but we were in a small little brick building down on 12th and Alexander Street. That's where Alexander Street School was located. It was an old building, and at the time I thought it was just that was it. Alexander Street was about 5 blocks from my house, maybe 5.5 blocks. And there was a white school called First Ward Elementary. It was about 3 blocks from my house, but because of segregation, we all went to Alexander Street, and that was the norm for us back then. But the physical structure, to talk a little bit about the inequities in terms of resources, and it didn't dawn on me at the time, but all of the African-American students in First Ward had to go to this one school called Alexander Street. And because all of the African-American students had to go to this one school, all of the students could not fit in that one school. So we had shifts. When I tell people that today, they just flat out don't believe it. But we had 2 shifts, meaning a morning shift from 8 to 12, and an afternoon shift from 12 to 4, simply because the physical plant was completely inadequate. In addition to that, you probably, particularly Dr. Ford, remember Dick and Jane. When they issued Dick and Jane to us as our readers, it was, we'd always say, wow, it's only 3 names before your name. It's only 2 names. There was never an opportunity to get a Dick and Jane where my name was the first name in the book, meaning I got the book as a new book. It was always hand-me-down books and materials Um, and it didn't really impact me because I'm a kid at that point. I'm a real child. But in terms of materials, band instruments, things that the teachers had to use to deliver an excellent education were just simply lacking. And as Brown was matriculating through society, and whites were moving out of First Ward, whites completely abandoned First Ward Elementary School. And around 1958 or so, they allowed us to close down Alexander. I'm a child now, so I'm reflecting back, but the system closed down Alexander Street and allowed us to move up to First Ward, along with those same African-American teachers. There were no white teachers in my experience, my whole experience of first grade to 12th grade. And as we went from elementary school to Second Ward, from 7th grade to 12th grade, the same things existed in terms of a cadre of just phenomenal teachers. I mean, I will never forget Miss Lucille McKay, my 7th grade English teacher, who would walk around. She was probably 4 feet 2 inches tall, but carried a big ruler with her and would make us diagram sentences at a real blackboard. They were par none in terms of their skill set, in terms of their content knowledge, in terms of their empathy for us and their feelings, and their beliefs that we could perform at very high levels. But as I got older, in terms of taking chemistry and biology and physics, you know, the world around me was changing in Charlotte in terms of civil rights. And so I recognized that I got a new book. I got a new lab book for physics, or a new lab book for chemistry. But Mr. Levi, doing a physics exercise, would say to me, well, we can't do this exercise. Flip over 4 more pages. We can't do this exercise because we didn't have the laboratory equipment. Laboratory equipment was the consumable items back in the day as it is today. And oftentimes we would get one iteration of lab equipment, and the next class wouldn't have that opportunity. So even with those things going on, those teachers performed admirably. The band, the choir, the drama, the yearbook staff, we functioned with less resources than Myers Park did, which was a school about 2 miles away from Second Ward. So the physical plan was absolutely clearly inequitable. And one of the things, as Pam articulated up front about the Swann case, it was about resources. You know, Brown was about resources. Swann was about resources. In the first iteration of Swann, the school board promised to do better. And they did a little bit better by giving us some materials. But as you recognize from the Swann case, there was a Swann 1 and Swann 2, when the school board was dragging its feet on the access to resources. And one solution to that, of course, was to make sure that all kids were in the same setting. And that's where the race and the busing came into play. But just keep in mind that that period of time for me was a phenomenal time in terms of the teachers. As I reflect upon it, certainly it's like an out-of-body experience to go back and think how horrible the opportunities were presented to us in terms of resources. So I would say that to you because as I graduated in 1966, starting about 1964, there was a domino effect of the closing of all of the Black high schools in Mecklenburg County around me as I was a student.
Right. And I think we want to talk, I think we'll see this reverberate later, but let's I want to move a little moving towards the present, which I really want to focus on. When Swann came, when busing came, what kinds of changes did you see in Charlotte, sort of particularly, sort of late 70s, 80s, as your children go to school in Charlotte?
Well, two things. This past Sunday, my wife and I was in the front yard of her childhood home, which is on Senior Drive, which is directly across the street from the front door of West Charlotte High School. And one of her classmates was walking down the street, and they started talking, and they had no idea that we'd be talking about Swann today. But the story came up of West Charlotte's band having to practice on Southwest Boulevard and Senior Drive because West Charlotte parking lot was all gravel. There was no pavement over there at West Charlotte's parking lot. So when you talk about the transition in terms of busing with students coming into West Charlotte from Eastover, they both laughed. They said overnight the gravel parking lot disappeared, that the band got new uniforms, the chorus got resources, the athletic department got resources. So Swann created, when the desegregation was put into place in the early 70s, late 70s, resources started going to those schools that did not have resources because white children were being assigned to the various schools. And that continued until about the late 80s, when, and I'm glad you said this, Pam, there's a difference between desegregation and integration, because we desegregated a couple of schools very well. We desegregated all the schools, but what people don't remember is that 80% of the busing for desegregation purposes was on the backs of Black children during that period of time. And when we got into the schoolhouse in some of the schools within Mecklenburg County, kids were actually resegregated because we had skills classes, regular classes, advanced classes, and of course, African Americans were there. But there were bright lights, and I have to admit that. My children went to, they rode the bus across town. One event that I always speak of, my daughter was a varsity cheerleader at South Mecklenburg High School, and there was a football game at Memorial Stadium between West Charlotte and South Mecklenburg. And it was very poignant for us as a family because my wife, when she went to West Charlotte, was a varsity cheerleader at West Charlotte back in the day. And so we reflected on looking at the South Mecklenburg, a formerly all-white school, with Black and white kids out there, hooping and hollering and supporting South Mecklenburg Sabres. And you look across the field at a historically African-American high school, West Charlotte, with white kids all interspersed into the stadium, white kids out there cheering, white kids in the band. And it really brought tears to my eyes because in some aspects, the socialization, the interaction with the Black and white students and the Black families and white families was a real plus. And I have to give credit for that experience. Although it was fleeting, although it wasn't deep, but at least there were moments where Charlotte was moving in the right direction. The business community, the leaders in the community had fought Swann all the way to the Supreme Court. But after the Supreme Court ruling, the business folks sort of saw that as a lever or a lever as relates to business, to show the rest of the world, while you were out throwing rocks in Boston at students on school buses, the folk here in Charlotte, in the New South City, was trying to make this thing called desegregation work. Now, that didn't last very long, but for a short period of time, the business community sort of embraced that experience and got us to where we are. Now, things did change, Pam, because in 1988, when Jan Richards ran for school board, she ran for school board on a neighborhood schools platform, and she won at large. And that was a signal that things weren't as good as it should have been. But we tried to fight through that by making sure that at least West Charlotte, and everybody paid attention to West Charlotte because it was the last historical Black high school that was still operating at that time in Mecklenburg County. So we made sure that the resources, both human resources and physical resources, were at West Charlotte. And we tried to do that at a lot of other places, but we didn't do it as well in trying to make sure that same experience at West Charlotte happened at Garinger or Independence or some of the other high schools. About 1992, when John Murphy came in 90 or 91, he decoupled the pairings that created a lot of desegregation in Mecklenburg County and started to go towards voluntary desegregation in 1992.
Right. Yeah, no, there's a move. I mean, there's a whole series of moves that take bit by bit resegregating prior to the lawsuit even, that do that. But I'd like to, if it's okay, Arthur, rather than going through those, which we did some of it last time, let's kind of jump to resegregation and jump to James Ford, who comes in at a period of time when, in fact, the schools have resegregated, and goes to a school, Garinger High School, that is a prime example of resegregation. And so I'd like to do two things. First, we have a question from a student about the present day and about the relationship of past and present. So if we could get that up, Alex, and then James, if you can start to talk about your experience at Garinger, relating it to some of the things that Arthur has told us about the history.
My name is Trayshawn Pickey. I'm currently a 12th grader at Harney University High School. And my question for the panelists is, do you think segregation still has a heavy influence on our current school systems? Thank you.
All right, James, if you'll.
Yeah, so, I'll start by thanking you all for having me, and by expressing that it's always a pleasure to sit at the feet of Arthur Griffin and to be able to hear his many stories. I love and appreciate him dearly and continue to learn from him. Unlike Arthur, I, as you have mentioned, am not a native Charlottean. I'm a transplant from the Midwest who moved down to Charlotte in 2010, relatively sight unseen, knowing nothing really of Charlotte's reputation as a New South city, and certainly having no background knowledge of Swann. I was a child of desegregation because the school district that I emerged from itself had endured some lawsuits, and I participated in, some desegregation efforts. And so, the schools that I went to were I was blessed, right? I experienced the legacy of Swann, even in, the Midwest, right? So that was not merely a localized thing. That was something that reverberated throughout the whole country. So I am a testament to that. But, moving to Charlotte and trying as a teacher to get the first job I could, I accepted a position at Garinger High School, knowing nothing of the neighborhood, knowing nothing of Garinger. And quickly found out after, making small talk with people in grocery stores or public places, that the school had a reputation just by the way they would react. Oh, you teach there or what have you. I always say those were some of the best years of my life. I found an amazing group of, Black and brown kids who, were, residents of Charlotte's urban core, the Crescent as we affectionately know it, many of whom were immigrants, many of whom were low income, et cetera, but who had phenomenal assets, phenomenal personalities, but also enduring some real challenges, some of which were socioeconomic. What I did not see was very many white kids. I could literally count in my 5-year tenure at Garinger on one hand how many white children I had. And it's worth noting that, you know, at least half of them were Bosnian, right? Were immigrants, right? Were folks who, you know, had come through the cultural corridor of East Charlotte. But the stunning absence of white kids was glaring. And the other thing that I noticed, to Arthur's point, was the resource disparity, right? I had stepped foot in enough of other Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools to see just how opulent some of the buildings were. I remember applying for a job at Audrey Kell and stepping in there and thinking, like, where have I landed? You know, like, this place is pretty decadent. And, you know, going to South Mecklenburg and going to various, and so I had enough of a sample size to know that once I stepped into Garinger, to see the mold on the walls, right? To see the accommodations or lack thereof, to see that sort of disparity in the same district was jarring. And so, you know, one can't help but start connecting dots and saying, well, geez, the lack of resources, lack of funding that exists here, given the population that it serves, might there be a connection? You know, I was thrust into finding that answer because, you know, after winning, you know, Teacher of the Year, you know, and developing kind of a voice locally, that all happened around the same time that Charlotte was enduring a student reassignment plan. And that's when I kind of got baptized into how contentious of an issue that this was locally. And that's when I, you know, all of the remediation, right? I have to give credit to like Amy Hahn Nelson, Roz Mickelson, who's become one of my professors. But, you know, Roz was writing papers and was calling this resegregation from years prior, saying this is what effectively is going to happen. To Arthur's point, once they started rolling back these efforts and returning to neighborhood schools, and ultimately, you know, Swann's reforms coming down, and you know, it's worth noting that as much as, you know, I was and in many ways still am a proponent of desegregation, that one of the things that Roz also mentioned was that, you know, there's some critiques, right, to how it happened. As Arthur mentioned, it was relatively one-way desegregation, not just in Charlotte, but across the country, right? It was primarily Black kids being bused and their historic schools being shut down, as you heard articulated. You know, but furthermore, there was what, you know, Roz Mickelson called, you know, second generation segregation, or what Vanessa Siddle Walker would call second class integration, right? Where it was done very poorly. And, you know, first generation segregation was, you know, that was, you know, segregation within school districts. But when you walked into some of the schools that were allegedly desegregated, what you saw was segregation at the class level. And so you heard Arthur speak some of that. And so you saw that play out at Garinger as well. And so you could argue, when looking at the present circumstance and, you know, CMS's award-winning research, which I saw you link there, the Breaking the Link report, that still resonates today, that the numbers would bear out that many of these schools that have gradually resegregated by race have also resegregated by class. So it's double segregation. And much of that has to do with the housing policy, right? And the lack of safeguards. And so that the return to neighborhood schools, an environment that, you know, with the legacy of redlining, the legacy of urban renewal, which destroyed neighborhoods like Brooklyn and took out schools like Second Ward, that when you do that, you create a design for resegregation when you adhere it with this neighborhood schools mantra. And so Garinger was one of those schools. So I didn't know any of that context. And I think the interesting thing is, if I could be transparent, once I started getting hip to the political goings-ons, I would tell the children, as, you know, buildings started to get tore down or as the rent started to get raised in nearby neighborhoods, I would tell them, you know, this ain't for y'all, right? Much like Arthur and then we're able to detect that the paving of the parking lot was not a response to some sort of, you know, hearts being thawed, or warming up to finally giving folks what their just due was. It was in preparation for other populations that were moving in. And so I've been out of classroom 7 years now. So when I drive through that old neighborhood and I see just how much has changed, the constituency of the school has changed as well. And so it's sad that as much, the more as the adage goes, right, the more things change, sort of the more things remain the same.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Arthur, do you have some thoughts related to hearing what James has said?
Well, I certainly do. When he said Roz Mickelson, I'd forgotten about Roz. Roz was such a key player back in the day. She wrote a piece. I got it out in my files called the Sunbelt City, as she looked at the business and political leadership's response to busing. And it's a real good piece. But when you think about Garinger used to be Central High. And so your colors sort of reflect my old school colors, because we got hand-me-down things. So the white schools like Harding was maroon and gold, and West Charlotte got maroon and gold, and Second Ward got the blue and white uniforms handed up. So when you look at today's environment, some of the things that we were fighting for decades ago, like extracurricular activities. I mean, just 2-3 weeks ago, there was an article in the newspaper that Garinger wasn't going to even have a football team, this season. This is 2021. When you look at some of the schools in the Crescent, I hate the Crescent, right? When you look at some of the schools where our kids live, and you look at 20 people in the band at a high school, or 35 people in the band at a high school, and go across town and you see 100 kids in the band at a high school, some of the decisions that we're making today really bring me back to Second Ward, to Torrance Lytle, Plato Price days, when we had great teachers, we had great people, but the resources and support wasn't there. And you reflect on that today. When I start thinking about this thing tonight, I went back and looked at the Swann. I got the original Swann filings out in my garage. I went back and thumbed through those, which is brown paper now. But the federal district court decision, and I made a copy of I'm gonna read a paragraph. It says, and this came out of the federal district court in Fourth Circuit. It said, Judge McMillan explained that, quote, the location of schools plays a large, if not determinative role in ensuring that any given assignment and feeder plan will provide meaningful desegregation, rather than just the predictably short-lived appearance of desegregation. In the years since this decree was issued, CMS has built 25 of 27 new schools in predominantly white suburban communities in the mid-1980s. CMS adopted a formal policy of building midpoint schools. And the reason why I'm raising this is I fought like hell to get that policy in. CMS adopted a formal policy of building midpoint schools, schools located midway between Black and white population centers. There is little evidence, the court says, however, to suggest that CMS faithfully adhered to this policy. So Garinger is the way it is today. We are where we are today because we took our eyes off the ball as a community. We could be a lot further along, but the policies that were made, the actions and inactions got us right back here. And so the focus needs to be on what was originally started with Brown and what was originally started with Swann, which is how do you provide access to the very best learning opportunities for all of our children, Black and white, green, purple,
Right. And James, you are working on that right now. I mean, you have moved into doing a lot of work, not particularly student assignment work, which, as you notice, just has been tremendously contentious, but also working within schools. And I'd love to have you talk something about what you're trying to bring to schools and districts to help create these kinds of opportunities.
Yeah, I think that you really hit the nail on the head there when you, Arthur, said returning to the spirit of Brown, right, and in the spirit of Swann, and Pam, what I would say is that is the notion of racial equity. I folks who follow me know I've written extensively and advocated for desegregation in times past. And like I said, I still am a proponent. I will admit that I have evolved a bit because I've learned some more things and some more context. That it's quite possible to have students who occupy the same school building and yet effectively live in totally different worlds. And so it begs the question that, is merely being in, and we know that the data historically shows that the cleverness of Brown v. Board and ultimately Swann, and that putting Black and brown kids in the same building, it makes them proximate to more resources. But when you start looking at the experiences, the access and opportunities through a racial equity lens, then it starts getting more complex. This thing of disproportionate discipline does not really emerge as a thing until the 1970s. Well, you have to, it doesn't take a mathematician, right? I'm social studies, not a math teacher, but Swann happens in 71 and kind of sets the stage for folks using busing. And then immediately what we're doing is we're busing Black and brown kids into schools. And it's worthy of investigating whether their cultural patterns of behavior, their ways and means of showing up were truly worthy of suspension or were treated in such a fashion. When you look at gifted programs and the enrollment of those programs, when those really take off, again, very similar time windows, right? And when you look at who is enrolled, who is identified as academically, intellectually gifted, overwhelmingly white, and in modern context, overwhelmingly Asian as well. We look at who is identified for special education and for what particular areas. Again, you'll notice the same pattern, and we can just go on and on and on. And it's also worth noting, like, that some of these things are mitigated by having a really diverse teacher workforce. As you heard Arthur mention, those Black educators during that time were expert practitioners. They would be called in the modern terminology and nomenclature as culturally responsive, right? Culturally responsive teachers, because they understood the ways in which students showed up where they came from, the neighborhoods, because they were invested. They came from those communities. All of those things, or any number of variety of those things, are part of the modern context where you might have a mixed groups of students in the building, but when you take a deeper look at it through those lenses, there's still not racial equity. And so our work really focuses on helping to realize, what does racial equity look like? Yes, it is important to diversify the attendees of a particular school. But if you get them in that school building and you don't reckon with the ways that teachers and administrators interact with students, and you don't look at the discipline data, and you don't do audits of the enrollment and rigorous courses and programs, if you aren't looking at all these things, you're effectively going to continue what is a very racialized system and passing it off as desegregation because you have, various colors and hues represented within the school building. And so, the work that we're doing at CREED, the Center for Racial Equity in Education, really calls attention to that on a state level. We produced a report 2 years ago, looked at the whole state in aggregate and disaggregated by race and across a host of different access and opportunity metrics. And what you see is that this is not merely a Charlotte thing. It's a North Carolina thing. And for being honest, it's a national thing. But we got to figure out how to respond to that now and return back to that spirit of equity. And the question is, can we do both at the same time? Can we rapidly work to desegregate in this changed environment, we're also focusing on the access and opportunity gaps for students of color in this environment. We're also, a lot of, those students are also low income as well. And so that's kind of where our work takes off. And I can talk a little bit more about some of the post-secondary work as well that kind of intersects, but I'll pause there for a moment.
Arthur, how do you react to that?
Yeah, I mean, when James talked about the changing of the environment, I thought about your work, Pam, actually, some things that you are doing, I guess you're still doing, at Shamrock Gardens, because your community changed over the cycle. Growing up in Charlotte, that was a white community. But that community rapidly changed over the years. It became more diverse, I would say, depending upon where you would draw your lines. And I think it is evolving even more so in terms of the diversity in your community. So the question becomes, then, what do we do in terms of providing the racial equity work in a particular environment like that? Because it's not just Shamrock, but when you look at the central city neighborhoods that are becoming more and more gentrified, the question will become, okay, how do we keep those children in the public schools, in that school, at the same time making sure it's delivering a first-rate quality education for all of the students who enroll at that school, regardless of their different backgrounds. And so I think Charlotte has sort of you said second generation, maybe it's a third generation opportunity as these neighborhoods start to gentrify themselves and more residents that are white living in the central business district area. How can we make sure that the promises of Brown, the promises of Swann can be revisited when those opportunities present themselves in 2021, 2025, because they will present themselves on the west side and in the Crescent as more and more people moving into those neighborhoods. The hope is you'll keep some of the legacy residents in those neighborhoods and they won't get kicked out. But if we could, look at the diversity opportunities. Sometimes we think that diversity is over. We can't do that, but we are a transitioning community. We're always moving. The demographics of our community is moving. They aren't moving as great as I'd like for them to be, but where there is some movement, how can we politically take advantage of that as a school district and as a city and as a county to make sure we have a public school that is reflective of our demographics across the board?
Well, and I think that really speaks to an important point, Arthur, because one of the themes of Charlotte is change. I mean, things are always changing. New people are moving in, neighborhoods are changing. I mean, that's been happening, basically the whole history of the city. And what the hard part is, what doesn't seem to change nearly as much is this racial hierarchy, is white supremacy. I mean, is the sense that I think I've talked to people, who said, we really hoped that by desegregating the schools, by bringing people together, by, letting them get to know each other a little better, that would really break down those barriers and break down some of that systemic hierarchy. And an awful lot of folks were disappointed that it did not happen to the extent there were greater opportunities. I mean, Harvey Gantt got to be mayor. There were opportunities for people to do things, but fundamentally those hierarchies didn't go away. And you see them in all of these changes in who can afford to live in the gentrifying neighborhoods, in how people moving into the gentrifying neighborhoods often look upon their neighbors, all sorts of challenges that really haven't gotten to some of that core core stuff. And so I think part of the challenge is, how do we do that? And is there a way that schools can do that? James, I don't know if you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I do. And first, let me just say, now you're asking the hard questions.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's where we're supposed to get.
Yeah,
We've got a whole
no, I love it. I love it. You know what? I was gonna challenge the listeners in attendance tonight to follow the through line. You heard Arthur mention in his experience in his elementary school in the second ward and et cetera. But then you heard about the underfunding, right? There was this phenomenal experience, but there was teachers doing more with less, and and having to make accommodations. And then you heard the anecdote about West Charlotte and the road not being paid, the parking lot not being paved, and then once the desegregation work happens, it being paved. I need you to understand, for everybody who can hear me, that when you talk about racial hierarchy, there are more ways to communicate than merely words. Okay. And the clear message that is continually being sent, and I would argue has been sent since the foundation of this country, is about the inherent value of some people over other people. And we're talking specifically about white people over black. And that is I know that is controversial in this day and age right now to assert such a thing. But let's be honest. We have a preponderance of evidence to support that argument, and I'd be open to anyone who would like to refute it. But that is really the core proposition: is, are we willing to really wrangle with, in our own ways, the way we reinforce these racial hierarchies? And that includes some of the folks who identify and view themselves as more progressive or politically aligned. Nicole Hannah-Jones, before she started being fried for her 1619 project, this was the topic that ended up often making her a target. Just confronting, oftentimes, of white liberals who in word would say all the right things, but really weren't really willing to wrangle with the ways that they enforce white supremacy. And so for me, and I love what Arthur said, in that, I wonder if there's a way we can still try to hang on to, a third generation. But there's a part of me, I'll be transparent, that says, listen, the school district is majority students of color. Okay. There no longer is a justification for making decisions that truly, most of the time, when you think about how Charlotte operates, center white folk. That also reinforces the racial hierarchy. We say that this small minority group, their voice, their values, their demands are of greater import than the that could also be, if we were to create a phrase for that, I would say that'd be white supremacy, right? So what does it look like for us to say the gloves are off? Let's start doing what we know is right, based upon the articulated and the empirical needs of the students. But my thought is that would lead to another school board takeover, right? That would be kicked around as a political football. But I want people to pause and look at the through line, and I'll pause here to say this. What we're talking about here, this doing more with less, that's not just a K-12 thing. We just convened representatives, our organization did, at Johnson C. Smith today, from the 10 HBCUs throughout the state. North Carolina has more 4-year HBCUs than any other state in the country. And whether they are UNC system supported or whether they're private independent, they will tell you the same exact thing, that's the historical legacy of HBCUs, that they are underfunded continually, perpetually, and made to do more with less. I just ask an honest question. Might that, given the history of racism, might that have something to do with race? That's all that I'm asking.
Well, and I think if you go back to, we were talking, Arthur, to the Swann case itself and to Julius Chambers, I think one of the things that it really does come down to, which children matter to the people who control the resources. And I like to say, Julius Chambers pushed for full desegregation of the schools. And he didn't do that because he thought somehow white kids were special and Black kids need to sit next to them to learn. He was very practical. He knew that the resources were controlled by whites. And at that point, the kids who mattered to the people in power were white. And the only way to get the resources spread evenly was to put white kids in every school. He thought that I think he saw other values of desegregation, but fundamentally, the reason you had to fully desegregate everything was how the resources were going to get spread. And again, I think that the hope had been that would change over time, and both attitudes and who had the power, and that changed much less than one would have hoped, particularly from the point of view of the kids, the lower income kids, the kids who aren't, don't end up in the suburbs like white counterparts. The kids who just are really struggling and who really need the help.
The desegregation, I think part two was the hope that we would fight and work collaboratively to make sure that all of the kids in those schools in a desegregated setting, that opportunities would improve. And I think that second part didn't come about, which created additional tension from families and parents to say, why are you busing my kid across town if they're still going to be sitting in the back of the class? And as you recall, only the youngest African-American children were bused across town, K-3, when the schools were paired. And that was a challenge for a lot of parents. And I think the initial thinking was somehow or another, the PTAs, the communities would rise up to make sure that once you got into those schools across town in a desegregated setting, that things would improve. I always like to, I'm going to sort of shift a little bit. We look at West Charlotte. We did a lot of work with West Charlotte, but there was no incentive pay. There were no extra stipend for teachers to go over to West Charlotte. They were handpicked. Those were public policy decisions, policies and practices that provided a certain level of resources, not just, as I talked about earlier, not just a parking lot, because a lot of parking lots were paved throughout Mecklenburg County. But there were leadership decisions that were made to determine who's going to go to West Charlotte and make sure that the right people are there providing quality instruction. We did not do that system-wide. We didn't look at Garinger or other schools to say, do we have the right mix? And when the school board made some efforts to do that, it met some resistance. But while I was chair, we used to always say, what name is on the bottom of your check? It says Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. So if your talents are needed at Garinger or your talents are needed at West Charlotte, then that's where your assignment would be. In 1992, with John Murphy, he changed that, and people embraced that. In 1992, he allowed principals to hire their staffs and didn't necessarily go through central office. And that created another issue of inequities, because the principals would decide this person fits better than this other person and not look at the entire school system and not look at it in terms of the schools, what was best for children. And so we allowed that to happen as a community, and now we're paying the price for it.
Well, and another thing that happened was, a significant reduction in the number of Black teachers. I mean, that's the other piece, that you see the percentage of African-American teachers in the system just dropping dramatically over the years, and therefore creating challenges for schools. I mean, when I went to Shamrock, most of the kids were African-American or Latino, and virtually all the teachers were white. They were good teachers and they cared about the kids, but there weren't the kinds of role models, and people had to learn to deal with kids. They didn't come in already knowing how to work with children from disadvantaged backgrounds, children of a different color, children from a different kind of culture. And I know, James, you're working some with that and with those, and I think that's a key part too as we talk about what are we going to do going forward. So maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. And so we just released a policy brief called Human Capital, spelled HUE, and the need for North Carolina to diversify the teacher workforce. Pam, you raise a point that is understated, and Arthur knows too well because we've talked about this. One of the casualties of Brown was that teacher workforce. And candidly, this is something I'm just coming into the knowledge of within the last 5 years. When we look at the dearth of Black and Brown teachers, it's important to understand that that is not an uncaused first cause, because when you ask people why is teaching primarily white women, society abhors a vacuum, they're going to fill that up with all sorts of narratives where they're not interested, and maybe they should go into North Carolina lost over the years at post Brown v. Board as many as 3,000 Black teachers, because as Arthur said, this was one way desegregation. And whereas we sent students, we did not en masse absorb those teachers into those schools because for any number of reasons. But you can just think about, in a racial hierarchy, can you really assert dominance over a white student and make them call you Mr. or Mrs.? There's just a bunch of reasons. But when you look back at that picture that Arthur shared, those teachers, many of them probably lost their jobs after Brown v. Board happened, and all that capital. Some might say, what does it matter what color they are, right? I mean, that might be a pushback. If you can teach, you can teach, but race ain't just about color. We're not just talking about that. We're talking about a cultural experience. We're talking about identity, a connection to community that tends to come along with those things. And a lot of that was just washed away. And so our work has been trying to raise the tenor, because since then there has not been a concerted effort in North Carolina and not Charlotte to do repair for that, right? There have been some programs in the past like Teaching Fellows, which did target folks of color and produce a lot of stellar educators. But the calls have continued to come, and we know what the problem is, right? The Drive Task Force as convened by the governor 2 years ago was really about that. If you look at the Leandro recommendations from the West End report, part of that is what they're saying. In order to respond to this, you might want to invest in having more diverse teachers, because these underfunded districts that are perpetually low performing, there tends to be a dearth of teachers of color. So I say all that to say that when we talk about, again, racial equity, we have to have a more holistic picture. And part of that is restoring teachers who look like, speak like, eat like, talk like, walk like the students that they're serving, because that matters too. It's not the whole ball game, but it's a significant part of it.
Well, and I think that's, to look at how we recover some of these things that were lost. I mean, I think, again, as Arthur, you talk about the, you had this doing more with less. And we kind of got rid of some of the less, but the doing the more, we lost that as well in a lot of ways, again, because of the way that that desegregation took place. Because although Julius Chambers and the NAACP won a legal victory, they didn't have political power, and legal decisions are carried out by politicians, essentially by policymakers. And so it didn't unfold in the way that, in a fully equitable way. So what are some of the other things that we need to do to work on recouping some of that. And James, I don't know, some of your work with the HBCUs may be directed that way.
I'll go after my elder Griffin, but I'm happy to talk more about that as well.
Did you want to speak?
We have a middle college, I think, focused towards teaching, but our community could get engaged with that. All the community colleges in North Carolina offer a 2-year degree in education that feeds into the university system. We can start generating the kinds of attitudes around teaching that could create more African Americans or Latinx and other folk going into the field of teaching. We have dozens of proven, experienced African American educators that have retired. If we could bring them back into fold to some degree as role models to serve not only in terms of working with non-African American teachers, but so that other students can see excellence in action from an African American perspective, could motivate more students to look to the field of education. Given that picture that I showed you earlier, more knowledge about the contributions and the successes of African American educators would certainly motivate more and more students to go into the field of education. I'm convinced of that, if no one else in the world is convinced of that. But to tell the story about Janie Hemphill, how that principal would walk the halls and mentor and nurture and support teachers like Bertha Maxwell Riley. So one day she ends up out at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, running the African American Studies Department. There are a lot of stories like that could be told that motivates any educator, whether you're Black or white. But I think more of that information should be shared. And I think you'd be able to turn that thing around. But it takes leadership. We can sit and talk all day, but it takes leadership to make it happen. What James spoke about earlier about the UNC system, Molly Broad had a whole presentation before she left the system about what's going to happen to teachers, both Black and white, in this state in a decade or two if we don't turn that thing around. And our leaders didn't respond to it.
James.
Yeah, I'm going to agree. There's a legacy there that is awe-inspiring, but like, Katherine Johnson in the movie, in the book, they're hidden figures, right? You just don't learn about them. And I think that, HBCUs, to be clear, of the teachers of color that are produced in the state, the majority come from the non-accredited education programs in the HBCUs. So they're still producing the majority of our diverse education candidates. And by the way, we're not just talking about Black, we're talking about Latinx as well, because, many of them attend HBCUs as well. But partnerships with our emerging HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions, most of which in North Carolina are community colleges. So you heard Arthur talk about early college, creating pathways through community college, which, kind of focus on education as a legitimate pathway, but, making this something that we do and seeing it as something that we do, I think can inspire a generation of diverse teacher candidates.
Well, we're moving toward the end here, and I think we've got one more question to read that will then also bring up the issue of why it matters to look at history, particularly at a time where looking at this has been sometimes contentious. So let's listen to Alex, if you can bring up the question. This is a CMS teacher, and then we'll see if we can't bring that home with talking about what all the different things you need to look at for history.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lillian Shaw. I am a teacher at Harding University High School, and I wanted to discuss the topic of school integration and how it has been thoroughly explored through the lens of African American struggle for access to adequate educational facilities. Dr. Griffin mentions that the local NAACP and African Americans in general also fought for access to culturally relevant curriculum before and after integration. It seems that this too is an ongoing struggle in schools, particularly with the nationwide manufactured critical race theory controversy. Do you recall the issues of curriculum concerns emerging during the Swann era? And what's your general opinion regarding culturally relevant curriculum and CRT debates? Thank you.
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think we'd say there have constantly been struggles. I mean, the first Black student protest after Swann, after the busing plan went into effect, was at South Meck High School, where a whole group of Black students walked out of the high school to protest in unequal treatment. I believe this was 1971, and one of the things they wanted was more courses in Black history. That was a standard thing, and that has been something that students have always asked for because it's generally been provided in a fairly limited supply. But maybe the two of you can talk. Obviously, this is a contentious moment right now as to what students are supposed to learn about history, why it matters, and just say a few words about why it matters that we talk about these kinds of things, that we look at Swann maybe in, not as celebratory light as it's often looked at. Why is it important to do this, even if it's not fun or, might make you not feel as good about your community or yourself as you might like to?
I'd certainly take the last part of that in terms of what happened, I guess, before and during and after integration. CMS named the building after a lady named Elizabeth Smoke Randolph. There's a building named after this woman. She was associate superintendent. And she was a principal. She was an educator first, a principal during the segregated schools. She was a principal at University Park Elementary School. And she made it a part of her life work as associate superintendent to make sure that the curriculum was relevant, particularly as it relates to being culturally diverse. She also had a program called Minority Achievement because she did not believe that only white kids could be in the academically gifted program, and wanted to work with other administrators to make sure that there was more diversity and opportunity in the academically gifted program here in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. As I said to you originally, my teachers, they were excellent subject matter experts, but I said something called affective education. They had high expectations for us, and they had feelings, meaning there was a relationship between students. And because of that relationship, the teacher and the student created a bond, a partnership to learn. And because of that partnership to learn, we both did our very best to be successful in the teaching and learning experience. If cultural relevant teaching doesn't exist, in my opinion, as a non-educator, you're not going to get that bond. You're not going to have that relationship that inspires, that motivates a youngster to do their very best. And I think that cultural relevant teaching is not, I'll say again, critical race theory. For the record. Thank you.
I appreciate you articulating that, even if they got the same initials, right? They're not the same thing. Listen, I'm really and truly just a history teacher at heart at the end of the day. So what I want to tell everybody is that, the hack or the thing about history, I used to always tell my students, is that this is not a line, it's secular. And so this is all the same thing, y'all. Generation after generation, time after time, slap a new label on it, new name, new thing to be outraged about, right? There were protests calling, desegregation, communism, and Marxism, right? Prior to that, there were folks who were lobbying to make sure that the lost cause was the narrative in textbooks all throughout the South. This is all the same stuff. And what it really boils down to is teaching folks who are not white an accurate and broadened history about themselves, but also teaching white kids an accurate history so that they can view themselves as part of a global society and a multiracial democracy. There are those who that frightens the daylights out of them. And we just have to be honest about that. But even culturally responsive teaching, when you hear Arthur, when you hear talk about his teachers, like that's my jam. Like, there's something in this moment where we have an opportunity to go to do Sankofa, right? The West African idea of going back and fetching it. We have in this moment the opportunity we were supposed to learn something from those luminary educators. And we may not have called it culturally responsive, but what they were doing was effectively that by any other name. And I'll close with this. We had Harvey Gann up in the picture kind of as the symbol, much like we did Obama, of racial progress. And Harvey and I, about 2 years ago, we sat down and did a podcast episode about Black teachers in the South because there was a scholarly article about these segregated schools in the South and how they produced actually some of the best and brightest civil rights leaders. And they were saying that this was not by accident. And Burke Industrial School in Charleston, South Carolina was one of these schools. And as you go through and look at the leaders that were produced by Burke, Harvey's name was in there. And Harvey will talk about those teachers in the same way you hear Arthur talking about his teachers right now. He said the way they taught about the Civil War, they taught it real. The way that they taught about the things that folks were capable of, they never frowned upon them. They let them know you're as capable as anybody else out there, that they were preparing them for a world that didn't exist. You can call that CRT right now, whatever, but that's what folks are afraid of, is a society where we actually view each other as equals, where we teach history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we're collectively forced to confront those things and really make a more perfect union. As much as all that stuff sounds good on paper, we have yet to realize that. And that's really the struggle we're engaged in. And so I saw somebody in the chat ask about HB 324. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And so that's our struggle now.
Well, I think that is, I think that is our struggle now. And I think that there are so many efforts, and I think the HB 324 is exactly that, trying to scare teachers. I mean, it's trying to make people be cautious and careful because you don't know what's going to happen if you upset people. And again, I think that's, if no one's upset, nothing's going to change. I mean, I think that's very important because for things to change, people need to really feel like they need to change and that they can be changed. And so I think that's just tremendously difficult. I know, James, you've, experienced some of that intimidation related to teaching the truth. I'm sure, Arthur, you experienced that too through the years when you've attempted to bring forward some hard truths about the society. And so it's there's a lot to be done. We accomplished some things with Swann, but there's the amount left to accomplish is just so much greater. And I appreciate both of the museum for holding this, for having this. I appreciate both of you for willing to be here and share your experiences and your thoughts. You know, we don't have all the answers, but I think we've gotten to some important things to consider. And we've just got a couple of minutes left. If either of you two have a couple of last remarks, we'll take this home.
Still a saying, I'll repeat a saying that John Lewis would always repeat, and that is, when you see something that is not right, that's not fair, and not just, you got to speak up. You have to say something and do something, and I'm going to keep saying something, and I'm going to keep doing something as best of my ability, because I believe in the ideals of this great nation, and I will work for those ideals to be realized, because I stand on the shoulders of a lot of great people, and I want the grandkids and great grandkids coming behind to really realize the dreams and promises that have been made and broken over the years. So I'm going to keep on saying something and doing something, and I won't give up. And I hope others will never give up. And I'm sure that Pam and James will never give up that fight. Thanks for having me.
And I don't have much to add other than just to appreciate and venerate Arthur Griffin, because you know, the truth of the matter is Arthur shouldn't have to be fighting no more. but you know, when those attacks get launched and, you know, things get hairy, one of the first people to always call and offer encouragement is Arthur, right? And so in the same way he stands on shoulders, you know, you won't get a James Ford or next generation other folks without his contribution and support. And so Arthur, I just want to say I appreciate you. And, you know, I believe in the ideas of this nation. And, you know, probably more than I should sometimes, right? Or more than a lot of other folks. But, you know, there's a never say die attitude. And I'll just leave kind of with some paraphrase Ron Edmonds, someone who Arthur put me on to, basically said that we know what we need to do, right? We just need to do it.
Wonderful.
Arthur and James, thank you so much for providing our audience with the insight on this significant time period in Charlotte's history and also the present day situation. And thank you to our audience for spending part of your evening with us. As a reminder, if you'd like to continue to support our engaging programming, content, and experiences, you can visit our website at museumoftheNewSouth.org to make a donation and to keep up to date on all the latest happenings at Levine Museum of the New South. Thank you again for engaging with us this evening. We hope that you have a great rest of the evening and a great Wednesday ahead. Thanks again.
Thank you.